Among history's most remarkable figures, two women stand whose strength and legacy still echo across centuries. Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia, and Mariana of Austria. Each carved her legacy across continents, navigating politics, tragedy, and power in a world ruled by men. Let us begin with the first, Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia. Elizabeth Stuart was born on the 19th of August in the year 1596 at Dunfermline Palace in Fife, in the Kingdom of Scotland. How did the cherished daughter of a king become a queen without a throne? What journey led this young princess from the palaces of Britain to the battlefields of Europe and finally into exile? Was her title as the Winter Queen a cruel irony or a symbol of enduring resilience beneath the frost of history? Please watch my full video until the end and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Please make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you. Now let us dive into the full story. Elizabeth's birth was a matter of great celebration, though her royal path was far from easy. She was the second child and only surviving daughter of King James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England, and Queen Anne of Denmark. Named after Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, the newborn princess came into the world at 2 o'clock in the morning. At the time, her father ruled only Scotland, yet his ambition would soon transform the future of 3 kingdoms. From infancy, Elizabeth was destined to carry not only noble blood, but also dynastic expectations that stretched far beyond the Scottish Highlands. In the spring of 1603, Elizabeth's life changed forever. With the death of Queen Elizabeth I of England, her father, King James of Scotland, was named her successor, becoming King James I of England and uniting the crowns of 2 kingdoms. Elizabeth, only 6 years old, was suddenly heir to a wider world of power and ceremony. Along with her mother, Queen Anne of Denmark, and her older brother, Prince Henry, Elizabeth traveled south from Scotland in what was described as a grand progress filled with celebrations and admiration from the English nobility. Upon arriving in England, Elizabeth was briefly introduced to the English court. Though she was not present at her parents' coronation, she quickly became known for her grace and poise, even at such a young age. Yet the splendor of royalty was soon shadowed by danger. Fears of plague led to her relocation away from London, first to Winchester and then to Oatlands Palace. Eventually, her care was entrusted to Lord and Lady Harrington at Combe Abbey, a place that would not only shape her education but also her fate. It was here, amid the quiet gardens and careful tutelage, that Elizabeth began to form her own identity as a princess of both English and Scottish lineage. She met Anne Dudley, a girl who would become a lifelong friend, and was trained in music, theology, and manners befitting a future queen. But beneath the surface of this peaceful setting, a deadly conspiracy was already forming, one that would soon place young Elizabeth at the heart of one of history's most infamous plots. In the autumn of 1605, whispers of treason stirred the kingdom, and Elizabeth Stuart, then just 9 years old, became an unexpected centerpiece in a deadly conspiracy. The infamous gunpowder plot, designed by a group of English Catholic extremists, aimed to assassinate her father, King James I, along with the Protestant leadership in Parliament. But the plan did not stop there. The conspirators had chosen Elizabeth, not her older brother Prince Henry, nor the young Charles, to be placed on the throne as a Catholic puppet queen. The reasoning was chilling in its calculation. Prince Henry would die in the explosion, Charles was considered too weak and young, and Mary too insignificant. But Elizabeth, intelligent, poised, and already familiar with public functions, was seen as capable of holding symbolic power. Their goal was to kidnap her from Combe Abbey, convert her to Catholicism, and use her presence to legitimize a Catholic uprising. Fortunately for the royal family, the plot unraveled before it could be carried out. Guy Fawkes was captured with barrels of gunpowder hidden beneath the House of Lords, and the conspiracy was exposed. Elizabeth remained unharmed, unaware of how close she had come to being manipulated as a political pawn in a national crisis. Yet this event marked her life forever, proof that even as a child, her lineage made her a symbol of power, ambition, and danger. In the eyes of many, Elizabeth was no ordinary princess. She was a living emblem of succession, faith, and threat. As Elizabeth grew into adolescence, her royal bloodline made her a central figure in Europe's dynastic ambitions. With her father now ruling both England and Scotland, her hand in marriage became a powerful diplomatic tool. From nearly every corner of Europe, envoys arrived with proposals, princes, dukes, and heirs, all hoping to win the favor of King James and claim the young princess as their bride. Among the most notable suitors were Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, Prince Maurice of Nassau, Frederick Ulrich of Brunswick, and even Philip III of Spain. Each match promised its own advantages: military alliances, religious solidarity, or expanded influence. But not all were suitable. Some lacked status, others were Catholics in a Protestant court, and a few faced opposition from Queen Anne, who wished to see her daughter marry into a truly royal house. Though politics dominated the decision-making, Elizabeth's future remained uncertain. Her charm and education added to her appeal, yet her own preferences were seldom considered. Still, one suitor gradually stood apart: Frederick, Count Palatine of the Rhine. A Protestant prince of high standing in the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick offered the balance of status and shared faith that King James desired. Elizabeth, too, found him agreeable. Behind the scenes, negotiations grew more serious. The courtly dances and formalities masked a deeper tension. This marriage would not merely unite two young royals, but also tether England's future to the shifting powers of Central Europe. And for Elizabeth, it would be the beginning of a path far more complex than any fairy tale princess could imagine. By late 1612, the stage was set for one of the most glittering royal unions of the age. Elizabeth's match with Frederick, Count Palatine of the Rhine, was more than a romantic alliance. It was a deliberate political move by King James to strengthen Protestant ties across Europe. Frederick arrived in England in October, charming both the court and Elizabeth herself. Though personal affection played a role, the true weight of the union rested on dynastic strategy. The wedding took place on the 14th of February in the year 1613 at the Royal Chapel of the Palace of Whitehall. It was a magnificent ceremony, filled with music, masks, and celebration. London came alive with festivity, and the people rejoiced at the union of their beloved princess with a noble Protestant prince. Writers and poets, including John Donne, composed tributes to the couple, and the occasion nearly bankrupted the royal treasury. After weeks of feasting, performances, and honors, the couple set out on their journey to the Palatinate. Along the way, they were welcomed by towns, entertained by musicians, and Elizabeth distributed gifts, often on borrowed credit. When they finally arrived in Heidelberg, Elizabeth was received with splendor. Frederick, determined to impress his new bride, built the English building within the castle and began constructing the famous gardens of Hortus Palatinus. It was a moment of triumph, hope, and transformation. For Elizabeth, the girl who had once been a target of plots and politics, her new life as Electress Palatine had begun, full of promise, power, and a future unknown. Elizabeth's arrival in Heidelberg marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only as a wife, but as a European princess in her own right. Surrounded by the wooded hills of the Palatinate, she settled into the elegant halls of Heidelberg Castle. Frederick had prepared the castle's English building in her honor and the construction of the Hortus Palatinus, a lavish garden designed in the English Renaissance style, soon earned international praise as the eighth wonder of the world. Life at court was filled with ceremony, learning, and diplomacy. Elizabeth quickly became a beloved figure in Heidelberg, admired for her intellect, grace, and sense of duty. Fluent in multiple languages, she corresponded with nobles and scholars, becoming more than a decorative royal. She was a cultural figure and political symbol of Protestant unity. Yet behind the grandeur, tensions stirred. Elizabeth had been promised precedence over Frederick's mother, Louise Juliana, a proud and influential matriarch. This created ongoing strain in the household. Despite the challenges, Elizabeth stood her ground, adapting to the intricacies of court life with remarkable poise. She also embraced motherhood with joy. Her first three children, Frederick Henry, Charles Louis, and Elizabeth, were all born in Heidelberg, cementing her new identity as a continental matron and future queen. But while court life seemed secure, rumblings from the east, from Bohemia, soon reached her doorstep. The future was shifting. In the midst of family growth and glittering ceremony, destiny was quietly preparing to test the resolve of the English princess abroad. In the year 1619, an extraordinary offer arrived that would change the course of Elizabeth's life forever. The Bohemian nobility, desperate to resist Catholic domination under the Habsburgs, had deposed King Ferdinand and sought a Protestant monarch to take his place. They turned to Frederick, Elector Palatine, Elizabeth's husband, offering him the crown of Bohemia. It was a dramatic opportunity, but also a dangerous gamble with sweeping political consequences. At first, Frederick hesitated. Accepting the crown meant defying the powerful Habsburg emperor and risking war. But Elizabeth, driven by faith and ambition, encouraged him to accept. She appealed to his honor, his duty to Protestantism, and his courage as a prince. Together, they imagined a future where their children would rule a powerful and independent Bohemia. That autumn, the couple entered Prague in triumph. On the 4th of November, Frederick was crowned in the majestic St. Vitus Cathedral. 3 days later, Elizabeth followed, crowned Queen of Bohemia in a brilliant ceremony. Their arrival was met with celebration, and the people cheered the royal family, especially the radiant young queen who had just given birth to their son Rupert. But beneath the joy, tension loomed. The Habsburgs viewed Frederick's rule as a direct threat, and the 30 Years' War was already erupting across Europe. As Elizabeth stood on the ancient stones of Prague Castle, basking in her new title, she could not have known how fleeting it would be. The dream of a Protestant Bohemia would soon collapse, but for a single, shining moment, she had become the queen she was born to be. Elizabeth's reign as Queen of Bohemia, though celebrated with hope and grandeur, would soon be remembered by a cruel nickname, the Winter Queen. Her husband's time on the throne lasted barely a year, and by the end of 1620, their dream had collapsed under the weight of war, betrayal, and imperial fury. The Habsburgs, determined to crush the Protestant uprising, rallied their forces with speed and strength. On the 8th of November, 1620, Frederick's army faced the Catholic League at the Battle of White Mountain. It was a crushing defeat. Within hours, the royal hopes of Bohemia vanished into smoke and blood. Frederick and Elizabeth had no choice but to flee Prague, abandoning their short-lived kingdom. But Elizabeth had already sensed the storm. Pregnant and fearing for her children's safety, she had left the capital before the battle and taken refuge at Castle Kustrin, near Berlin. There, on the 6th of January, 1621, she gave birth to their son Maurice, even as her crown slipped away forever. The family could not return to the Palatinate either, their homeland had been invaded by Spanish and Catholic forces. Dispossessed and vulnerable, they accepted an offer of refuge from the Prince of Orange and journeyed to the Netherlands. Their royal chapter in Bohemia was over, and exile awaited. The girl who had once stood proud in coronation robes now found herself wandering foreign lands with a young family, a fallen title, and a world at war, yet still unbroken in spirit. In the spring of 1621, Elizabeth and Frederick arrived in The Hague, welcomed by the Dutch court but burdened by loss and uncertainty. Though given refuge by the Prince of Orange, their court in exile was modest, often struggling with limited funds and political frustration. Yet Elizabeth, refusing to be defeated by fate, quickly adapted to her new reality. She transformed her household into a hub of Protestant solidarity, hosting diplomats, artists, and thinkers who supported their cause. But it was a life of constant strain. As Frederick tried to rally support for reclaiming his lands, Elizabeth managed the home front, raising children, writing letters, and keeping their court alive in spirit if not in splendor. During these years, she gave birth to 8 more children, each arrival a reminder of hope amid hardship. The youngest, Gustavus, was born in 1632, in the very month that Frederick, desperate to restore his fortunes, set off to join King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden. Their reunion never came. Frederick fell ill and died before returning to The Hague. Elizabeth's grief was profound. For 3 days, she refused food, drink, or sleep. When invited to return to England by her brother Charles I, she declined. She would not abandon her son's claim, nor the memory of her husband's sacrifices. Court life in exile was no fairy tale. It was a balancing act of dignity, motherhood, and diplomacy. And though many around her questioned her cause, Elizabeth pressed on, becoming not only the Winter Queen but the enduring matriarch of a displaced dynasty. After Frederick's death in late 1632, Elizabeth's world shifted yet again. No longer a queen consort, she was now a widowed exile, mother to many, and guardian of a fading royal legacy. But instead of retreating into sorrow, she found renewed purpose. Her eldest surviving son, Charles Louis, became the focus of her efforts. She was determined to secure his rightful inheritance, the electorate of the Palatinate. Elizabeth became an active political player in European affairs, writing countless letters to courts, nobles, and allies. She pleaded for support, argued with diplomats, and positioned her son as the legitimate Protestant heir amid a continent fractured by war. Though many dismissed her influence, her persistence bore fruit. As the 30 Years' War dragged on, alliances shifted. Finally, in 1648, the Peace of Westphalia restored Charles Louis to the Palatinate, a hard-earned triumph that Elizabeth had spent over 15 years fighting for. Yet even as her son reclaimed his birthright, she was not welcome to share in his court. Their relationship had grown distant, marked by resentment, independence, and time. Still in The Hague, Elizabeth remained a symbol of Protestant resistance and cultural refinement. She patronized the arts, supported Protestant refugees, and maintained correspondence with influential figures across Europe. But her victories came at a cost. She had lost several children to illness, watched her homeland change without her, and faced the quiet loneliness of a queen without a crown. Even in widowhood, Elizabeth's voice echoed through Europe, steady, intelligent, and unwavering. Her fight had not only been for thrones, but for memory, honor, and the survival of her family's name. In the decades following her husband's death, Elizabeth Stuart emerged as more than just a political figure. She became a cultural force. Living in The Hague, she surrounded herself with poets, painters, scholars, and theologians. Her court in exile, though modest in resources, became a vibrant salon of Protestant intellect and artistry. Elizabeth's love for books and learning was lifelong. Fluent in several languages, she maintained an active correspondence with leaders and thinkers across Europe. Her letters revealed not only her political wit, but also her deep understanding of human nature and diplomacy. She commissioned portraits, family memorials, and symbolic artworks, using visual expression to preserve the memory of her lost throne and husband. One of the most notable was the Grand Triumph portrait of 1636, which honored her family and legacy as the Winter Queen. Another masterpiece, a marble bust sculpted in 1641, captured her regal presence as a widowed matriarch, dignified, proud, and reflective. Through these works, Elizabeth curated her own memory, ensuring that her story would not be forgotten. She also took interest in the futures of her children and grandchildren, carefully arranging matches and watching over their education. Though relationships were often strained by distance and grief, she remained deeply involved in shaping their paths. In exile, Elizabeth never held a court of gold, but she built one of memory, intellect, and purpose. Even without a kingdom, she left behind a legacy etched not just in politics, but in poetry, portraiture, and the pages of Europe's cultural history. As the years wore on, Elizabeth's once promising future grew increasingly marked by sorrow. Between the late 1630s and early 1650s, she suffered a heartbreaking series of personal losses. 4 of her children, Gustavus, Philip, Henriette Marie, and Maurice, all died within a span of just over a decade. Each death struck a deep blow, leaving her increasingly isolated from the family she had once fought so hard to keep together. Her brother, King Charles I of England, was executed in 1649 during the English Civil War, plunging the Stuart family into further disarray. The political tides were shifting, and Elizabeth, once the celebrated daughter of a king, found herself without a throne, a court, or even close ties to the ruling powers of Europe. The relationships with her surviving children also began to fray. Charles Louis, now restored to the Palatinate, grew cold and independent. Others, like Rupert and Sophia, carved out their own lives with little reliance on their mother. For all her efforts and sacrifices, Elizabeth faced old age with a dwindling circle of loyal supporters. Her status as a once powerful queen was now a faded memory to many. Yet she endured, preserving her dignity and remaining active in court life where she could. In letters and appearances, she still radiated the presence of a queen, though the crown was long gone. The girl who once inspired poets and painters was now a quiet widow, reflecting on victories past and the fading strength of a royal name. In the year 1660, the restoration of the Stuart monarchy offered Elizabeth a final chance to return home. Her nephew, Charles II, ascended the throne of England, and after nearly 4 decades in exile, Elizabeth Stuart made her long-awaited journey back. She arrived in London on the 26th of May, 1661, not as a triumphant queen, but as an aging survivor of one of Europe's most turbulent centuries. Though her return was quiet, it held deep meaning. For the first time in years, she was once again within the heart of the Stuart world, surrounded by familiar places, old memories, and traces of the family she had fought so hard to defend. She moved into Drury House, establishing a small but elegant household. Friends and sympathizers visited, offering companionship and respect. Though political power had slipped from her hands, her presence still commanded a certain reverence. Elizabeth did not plan to return to The Hague. She arranged for her belongings to be sent from the Netherlands and settled into the rhythm of London life, albeit in fragile health. Her thoughts often turned to her children and grandchildren, especially Sophia of Hanover, whose lineage now stood poised to inherit the English throne. In her final months, Elizabeth remained thoughtful and composed. She had lived through coronations and coups, war and exile, joy and heartbreak. And now, in the city where her mother once walked and where her brother had died, she faced her last chapter with quiet grace. History had called her the Winter Queen, and in her return to England, winter had gently come full circle. By the start of 1662, Elizabeth's health had sharply declined. She had moved from Drury House to Leicester House in Westminster, hoping for more comfort and space, but her body was failing. On the 10th of February, she began bleeding from the lungs, the sign of severe pneumonia. 3 days later, just past midnight on the 13th of February, Elizabeth Stuart, the Winter Queen, passed away quietly in her chambers. She was 65 years old. Her death caused little stir in the public eye. England was preoccupied with its newly restored monarchy, and the woman who had once symbolized hope for Protestant Europe was now a distant echo of a former age. Her only son to attend the funeral procession was Prince Rupert, famed for his exploits in the English Civil War. The rest of her children were scattered, estranged, or already gone. On the 17th of February, Elizabeth was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, in the chapel of Henry VII, close to her beloved brother, Prince Henry, and her Stuart ancestors. Though her final years had been marked by solitude, her burial was a quiet tribute to her royal blood and the complex life she had lived. She had been born a princess of Scotland, crowned a queen in Bohemia, exiled across Europe, and returned at last to the land of her birth. In life, she had fought for crowns, for children, for legacy, and in death, she rested among kings. Elizabeth's story had been short in reign, but long in endurance. The winter had finally ended, but her name, her struggle, and her legacy would continue to echo through centuries of royal history. Though her crown had faded and her power long diminished, Elizabeth Stuart's legacy endured, not only in memory, but through bloodlines that shaped the future of Europe. Her youngest daughter, Sophia of Hanover, became the key figure in the Act of Settlement of 1701, which barred Catholic succession and paved the way for Protestant heirs. When Queen Anne died in 1714, Sophia's son, Elizabeth's grandson, ascended the British throne as George I. Thus, Elizabeth became the matriarch of the House of Hanover, the royal line that would govern Britain for centuries to come. Beyond dynasties, her influence lingered in art, letters, and legend. Poets celebrated her beauty and sorrow, while sculptors and painters preserved her regal image for posterity. Historians dubbed her the Winter Queen, a title both mournful and majestic, symbolizing the fleeting brilliance of her reign and the enduring strength of her spirit. In the United States, two landmarks, the Elizabeth River in Virginia and Cape Elizabeth in Maine, bear her name, silent witnesses to a princess who never set foot in the New World, but whose story reached across oceans. Writers and novelists have continued to revisit her tale, fascinated by the woman who stood at the crossroads of war, religion, and royal destiny. Elizabeth Stuart's life was marked by triumph and tragedy, exile and resilience. Though she wore her crown for only a single winter, her impact spanned generations. She was a queen without a kingdom, but with a legacy written not in gold, but in history itself. Let us now turn to another remarkable figure of royal descent. Mariana of Austria was born on the 24th of December in the year 1634 in Wiener Neustadt, in the Archduchy of Austria. How did this quiet and devout girl become the central pillar of a crumbling Spanish monarchy? What unseen toll did she pay as both daughter and niece to emperors, and later as queen and regent? And how did Mariana navigate an empire filled with war, illness, and powerful enemies, while trying to preserve the future of her fragile son? Mariana was the youngest child of Emperor Ferdinand III and Maria Anna of Spain. Born into two great but faltering dynasties, she carried the legacy of both the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs. Her early years were shaped by courtly rituals, Jesuit teachings, and the weight of dynastic planning. As a young girl, Mariana was originally intended to marry her cousin, the future Emperor Leopold I, a match that would have united the Austrian and Spanish crowns once more. But politics intervened. After the death of her uncle, King Philip IV of Spain, and the tragic loss of his heir, Mariana's destiny was abruptly redirected. The aging king, desperate for a new wife to secure the succession, proposed marriage to his own niece. At barely 14 years old, Mariana was told she would marry her uncle and become Queen of Spain. It was a duty she could not refuse. Thus began the story of a princess sent not only to preserve a royal line, but to carry an empire on her shoulders. From the moment of her birth, Mariana's life was shaped not by personal desire, but by the responsibilities of empire. As the daughter of Emperor Ferdinand III and a Spanish infanta, she was raised in a world where lineage was everything. Her childhood at the imperial court in Vienna was structured around religious devotion, courtly manners, and the constant reminder that she was a Habsburg, and Habsburg daughters had duties far beyond the nursery. Tutored by Jesuit priests, Mariana was immersed in the Catholic teachings that would define her life. She was known for her intelligence, calm temperament, and remarkable piety, often spending hours in prayer even as a child. Her mother, Maria Anna, herself a daughter of Philip III of Spain, instilled in her the importance of family loyalty and political obedience. At court, Mariana saw firsthand how alliances were brokered and fates sealed through marriages. Her brothers and cousins were sent across Europe to secure thrones and influence. For Mariana, the expectation was no different. She was originally promised to her cousin Leopold, a match designed to keep the Habsburg bloodline concentrated and politically powerful. But as plague, war, and dynastic instability ravaged both Austrian and Spanish territories, plans changed. The family's vision for Mariana shifted from imperial bride to royal salvation. Her value lay not just in her blood, but in her role as a bridge between two fading empires. Even before she reached adolescence, Mariana understood that her life would not be her own. She was being prepared not for happiness, but for history. In the winter of 1646, Mariana's life took a dramatic turn. At just 12 years old, she learned that her betrothal to Leopold would be annulled. Instead, her new destiny was far more controversial. She was to marry her own uncle, King Philip IV of Spain. The decision, shocking even by Habsburg standards, was born from dynastic desperation. Philip's only surviving son had died young, and his new marriage to a fertile, loyal Habsburg niece was deemed essential for producing an heir. For Mariana, the news was not delivered as a proposal, but as a command. The marriage had been carefully orchestrated by political advisors and religious figures across both courts. Mariana's piety and submissiveness made her the ideal candidate, unlikely to rebel, and capable of embracing the austere Spanish court without complaint. Still, behind the noble intentions lay an unsettling truth. She was being asked to marry a man 30 years her senior, who had known her since infancy. The papal dispensation arrived in 1649, granting permission for the closely related pair to wed. The union was justified as a matter of state, not sentiment. On the eve of her departure, Mariana underwent a flurry of preparations, new clothing, titles, and Spanish lessons. She would leave Vienna not as a young girl with dreams of love, but as a symbol of survival for a collapsing empire. The political gamble was immense. Mariana was now the last hope of the Spanish Habsburgs, a teenage bride asked to rescue a royal line with her womb, her will, and her silence. In late 1649, Mariana of Austria arrived in Madrid after a long and ceremonial journey from Vienna. At just 15 years old, she entered the capital of an empire burdened by war, debt, and decline. The Spanish court, known for its rigid etiquette and solemn atmosphere, greeted her with pageantry, but also with watchful eyes. She was no ordinary queen. She was both niece and bride to the king, a walking symbol of dynastic urgency. Mariana's marriage to Philip IV was formally celebrated on the 7th of October, 1649. The ceremony was grand but joyless, steeped more in obligation than affection. Philip, now in his early 40s, was weighed down by grief, state burdens, and the ghosts of lost heirs. Mariana, though young, carried herself with grace, her austere upbringing preparing her for the rigid life ahead. Immediately, she was immersed in the expectations of Spanish queenship, piety, submission, fertility, and public devotion. She adopted the Spanish language, customs, and court dress with swift obedience. Her days became filled with religious observance, formal appearances, and the constant presence of chamberlains and confessors. While Philip respected Mariana's intelligence and devotion, theirs was a union shaped by protocol, not passion. He kept his distance, and she, ever dutiful, accepted her limited influence. Her role was not to advise, but to bear children and embody royal dignity. Thus, Mariana's life in Madrid began, not with intimacy or comfort, but with the silent weight of succession and statehood. The crown she wore sparkled, but behind it stood the quiet resolve of a girl already called to endure far more than most queens ever would. Mariana's new world inside the Spanish court was not one of splendor, but of silence and ceremony. The Habsburg court in Madrid was famously rigid, bound by an intricate system of etiquette that governed everything from how one walked to how one addressed the queen. Life at the royal palace moved slowly, wrapped in ritual and shadowed by control. From her first days as queen, Mariana found herself closely watched, not only by courtiers, but by the king's advisors and the powerful confessors who managed palace life. She was expected to embody piety and chastity, to perform religious duties publicly, and to maintain a physical distance even from her husband. Touch, intimacy, and open speech were luxuries rarely permitted. The queen's presence was ceremonial, to be seen, not heard. The strict routine left little space for emotional comfort. Meals, prayers, and audiences were all governed by unbending schedules. Mariana's ladies-in-waiting followed her every movement, reporting her moods and behaviors to higher authorities. Behind gilded walls, she lived more like a cloistered nun than a ruling consort. Still, Mariana adapted. Her upbringing in the deeply Catholic Austrian court had prepared her for self-discipline. She became fluent in the silent codes of Spanish royalty, offering devotion rather than resistance. If she could not speak freely, she would survive quietly. In this world of velvet masks and marble floors, Mariana learned that influence was earned not through command, but through endurance. And as Spain's future remained uncertain, the young queen would need all the patience she could summon. From the moment Mariana entered the Spanish court, the weight of expectation rested heavily on her shoulders to produce a male heir who would secure the Habsburg dynasty. But her journey toward motherhood would be fraught with heartache and difficulty. Between 1650 and 1657, Mariana endured multiple pregnancies, each bringing with it hope, pain, and public scrutiny. Her first child, a daughter named Margarita Teresa, was born in 1651 and survived, a small joy in a court desperate for sons. But subsequent pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death. The tension between Mariana's quiet endurance and the court's growing anxiety intensified with each loss. At last, in 1657, Mariana gave birth to a son, Philip Prospero. The court rejoiced, and the ailing king saw in the child a symbol of renewal. But the infant prince was frail, plagued by health problems from the start. Mariana, who had always been devout, poured her life into caring for him, retreating even further into religious devotion as a way to cope with her fears. Despite her prayers and care, Philip Prospero died in 1661 at just 4 years old. The grief was devastating, not just personally but politically. The Habsburg future was again in peril, and Mariana was blamed in whispers for her inability to produce a strong male successor. Her trials did not end there. She suffered more miscarriages and another short-lived son, leaving the court teetering on despair. Mariana's role as queen was now inseparable from sorrow, her crown polished in public but privately soaked in tears. And yet she endured, believing still that her suffering had meaning in the eyes of God. For Mariana of Austria, faith was not a performance, it was survival. In the deeply Catholic world of 17th century Spain, religion was more than belief. It was identity, governance, and law. Mariana embraced this fully, not only because it was expected of her as queen, but because it gave structure and solace to a life marked by loss and duty. Her days were punctuated by ritual morning prayers, mass, fasting, confession, and charity. She was deeply influenced by the Jesuits, whose guidance shaped her worldview and political thinking. Far from being passive, her devotion became a quiet instrument of control. Mariana earned respect from the Spanish clergy and positioned herself as a moral pillar within the royal household. The Spanish people, too, revered her for this. While Philip IV was often distant or distracted, Mariana's piety and visibility at religious functions made her a symbol of Catholic virtue. She supported convents, funded religious art, and upheld Catholic values in all matters of court and family. Yet this religious intensity came at a cost. Her dependence on confessors, especially the powerful Father Nithard, blurred the lines between spiritual counsel and political manipulation. Critics whispered that the Queen's Chapel had become a second council room where the fate of the empire was shaped behind embroidered curtains and golden altars. Still, Mariana believed her path was righteous. In a world unraveling through war, illness, and instability, she clung to faith as her compass. Through devotion, she found not just comfort, but purpose, and in her eyes, God's will always justify the crown's burdens. In the summer of 1665, Philip IV of Spain fell gravely ill. Years of political strain, personal loss, and declining health caught up with him. Mariana, by now 30 years old and accustomed to sorrow, remained by his side, praying fervently for his soul. On the 17th of September, the king died at the royal Alcazar of Madrid, leaving behind a fragile kingdom and a 4-year-old heir, Charles. With Philip's death, Mariana's role changed overnight. No longer just queen consort, she became queen regent, charged with guiding the Spanish monarchy until her son could rule. Official mourning cloaked the court, but behind the black veils, a new power dynamic emerged. Mariana, long underestimated for her quiet nature, stepped forward into the vacuum left by her husband. Her authority as regent was supported by Philip's will, but it was also contested. Many doubted her strength and accused her of being too reliant on foreign advisors, especially her former confessor, Father Nithard. Yet Mariana held firm, drawing from her deep sense of duty, her command of religious symbolism, and her steady resolve. In the face of court factions and external pressures, she positioned herself not only as a mother defending her son's inheritance, but as a woman entrusted by God to guard a wounded kingdom. For the first time in her life, Mariana's voice mattered, and she would use it not with noise, but with unwavering conviction and carefully chosen silence. With the crown resting precariously on the head of her fragile young son, Charles II, Mariana stepped into a role rarely granted to women in Spain, absolute authority as Queen Regent. From 1665 onward, she governed the Spanish Empire in her son's name, navigating a labyrinth of internal divisions, foreign diplomacy, and looming decline. Mariana established her Regency Council, appointing trusted figures like Father Nithard, whose influence over her soon drew sharp criticism. The Spanish nobility, long wary of foreign-born advisors, accused her of being manipulated and of placing Austrian interests above Spain's. But Mariana, steady in purpose, believed in the righteousness of her rule. Her governance was marked by religious conservatism, careful diplomacy, and a desire to preserve unity. Despite constant resistance, she negotiated with European powers, sought to stabilize finances, and oversaw decisions in the Spanish Netherlands and the crumbling colonies. Yet each success was shadowed by court infighting. The Council of Castile and powerful grandees plotted against her influence, questioning a woman's place at the helm of empire. Her regency was further burdened by Charles's worsening condition. The boy king's health was visibly deteriorating, and whispers of his unfitness for rule added urgency to Mariana's leadership. She clung to her role as both protector and ruler, believing divine will had entrusted her with the kingdom's survival. Though beset by enemies and bound by rigid customs, Mariana ruled with dignity and discipline. Her regency was not marked by bold transformation, but by determined preservation, a slow defense of monarchy against the tide of decline and the chaos of politics. As Mariana's regency progressed, opposition to her rule grew fiercer, and with it came new alliances and enemies. Seeking loyal support, she elevated Fernando de Valenzuela, a minor court official, to positions of immense influence. Valenzuela's rapid rise, from chamberlain to Secretary of State and eventually to Chief Minister, shocked the nobility and enraged powerful factions at court. To many grandees, Valenzuela was a social upstart, unworthy of such favor. His presence symbolized everything they resented: Mariana's centralization of power, her defiance of noble privilege, and her reliance on trusted inner circles rather than established elites. Court gossip painted him as Mariana's secret favorite, fueling rumors and conspiracies against the Queen Regent. Tensions exploded when John of Austria the Younger, the illegitimate half-brother of the late King Philip IV, returned to court with ambitions of his own. Popular with the army and admired by many nobles, he positioned himself as a defender of traditional Spanish authority and as a rival to Mariana's influence. In 1677, John led a palace coup with the backing of discontented nobles and forced Mariana to dismiss Valenzuela. The minister was arrested and exiled, and Mariana's political authority was sharply reduced. Though she remained regent in name, much of her power shifted to John and his allies. The episode left Mariana deeply wounded. It marked the end of her dominance at court and the beginning of her quiet withdrawal from politics. Yet even in retreat, she remained a watchful mother and devout figure, determined to protect her son's fragile reign from the shadows. Following the removal of Valenzuela, Mariana's position at court became increasingly unstable. Though she retained her title as Queen Regent, real authority had shifted. John of Austria, the Younger, now steered the court with popular support, sidelining Mariana and dismantling the structures she had built during her years of careful governance. In 1677, Mariana was formally exiled from Madrid. She was sent to the royal Alcazar of Toledo, a symbolic retreat cloaked in courtesy but grounded in political punishment. There, surrounded by a loyal but diminished household, she lived in semi-isolation, watching the court move on without her. Though distant, she remained informed. Letters and trusted couriers kept her updated on the deteriorating condition of her son, Charles II, whose health had continued to decline. The boy king, now a teenager, was increasingly unable to govern, yet too frail to be replaced. Mariana saw this tragedy unfold from afar, her influence muted, her maternal instincts burning with worry. The exile marked one of the lowest points in Mariana's life. Once the most powerful woman in Spain, she was now reduced to a silent figure, waiting for permission to return. Yet she did not collapse. She continued her religious devotions, wrote frequent letters, and clung to the belief that God's plan still had a place for her. In her quiet rooms in Toledo, Mariana waited for redemption, for restoration, or perhaps just for history to remember that she had once ruled an empire not with force, but with endurance. After years of forced exile in Toledo, Mariana of Austria was finally permitted to return to Madrid in the early 1680s. The return was quiet and cautious, not a triumphant restoration, but a dignified re-entry. By now, Mariana was no longer queen regent, but the dowager queen, mother to a monarch in constant decline. Her once commanding presence at court had faded, but her sense of duty had not. Mariana took residence in the Alcazar once more, though far removed from the chambers of power. She lived in relative seclusion, surrounded by loyal ladies, chaplains, and the comforting routines of faith. Yet her influence was not entirely gone. Many still came to her for counsel, and foreign ambassadors continued to pay her visits, recognizing her enduring symbolic weight in European diplomacy. She focused her remaining strength on her son, King Charles II. His condition, both physical and mental, had worsened, and Mariana resumed a mother's watchful care. Though she no longer directed policy, she acted as emotional anchor to a king who struggled with basic tasks of rule. Mariana's strength now showed not in proclamations or councils, but in endurance, in her ability to survive loss, political disgrace, and years of personal sorrow without surrendering her dignity. She had been a bride, an empress, a regent, and a target. Now, in her twilight, she was something more rare, a woman who had outlasted the tide of her own era, still standing in the shadows of the Spanish throne. As Charles II entered adulthood, it became painfully clear that he was not equipped to rule a vast and troubled empire. Frail, slow of speech, and frequently unwell, he was a living emblem of Habsburg decline. Mariana, though no longer regent, remained the one constant presence in his life, mother, guardian, and quiet strategist behind the throne. She managed his household with care, ensured his religious duties were fulfilled, and shielded him from the cruelties of court gossip. Charles was often manipulated by competing factions, but Mariana remained his most trusted figure. Even those who opposed her politically knew that her bond with her son was genuine and unbreakable. Her greatest concern now became succession. Charles had no children, and his deteriorating health made the extinction of the Spanish Habsburg line a looming certainty. Mariana, though weakened herself, worked tirelessly to keep the court stable and prevent outside powers from seizing advantage. She supported certain diplomatic marriages and tried to balance French and Austrian interests, always with Charles's fragile future in mind. Despite personal grief and political loss, Mariana found purpose in this maternal role. She prayed daily for Charles's recovery and legacy, even as time worked against them both. Through it all, she remained calm and composed, the last great protector of a boy king whose crown grew heavier by the year. In the silence of aging halls and dimly lit chapels, Mariana continued her quiet vigil, guarding the dignity of a dynasty on the edge of collapse. By the late 1690s, Mariana of Austria had become a shadow of her former self, a dowager queen surrounded by memories, regrets, and flickering candlelight. Once at the heart of empire, she now moved slowly through the corridors of the royal palace, her influence waning with each passing year. The court had changed, and so had Spain. Charles II remained on the throne, but his health and mental state had deteriorated beyond hope. Mariana, deeply worried yet powerless to change his fate, became more withdrawn. Her earlier political efforts to secure succession through careful marriage diplomacy had been bypassed, as foreign powers began maneuvering over who would inherit the Spanish crown. Though still revered by some as a symbol of continuity and Catholic virtue, Mariana was increasingly excluded from real decisions. Ministers and foreign ambassadors now worked around her, no longer seeking her counsel as they once had. Even Charles, once dependent on her presence, was now pulled by other advisors. Her days were filled with religious observance, quiet reading, and moments of reflection. She commissioned masses for lost family members, wrote letters to distant relatives, and sought spiritual comfort in the Jesuit teachings that had long shaped her worldview. Yet even in obscurity, Mariana never lost her composure. She bore the slow erosion of her role with the same grace that had once steadied a kingdom. Hers was not a reign marked by grandeur, but by endurance, and as her final chapter neared, she remained the quiet guardian of a crumbling world, steadfast to the end. Mariana of Austria died on the 16th of May in the year 1696 in the royal Alcazar of Madrid. She was just 60 years old, yet her life had spanned empires, marriages, wars, and regencies. Her death was quiet, as her later life had been no grand processions, no sudden shifts in power, only the slow closing of a long and solemn chapter in Spanish history. Her passing was marked with official mourning, but the Spain she left behind was no longer the powerful force it once had been. The empire was fractured, its monarchy teetering on the edge of collapse. Her son, Charles II, remained king but was in worsening health, childless and surrounded by vultures vying for succession. Mariana had tried again and again to preserve the Habsburg legacy, but fate and blood had conspired otherwise. Mariana was buried in the El Escorial Monastery, the resting place of Spanish royalty, among kings and queens who had shaped centuries. Yet her memory was not celebrated with pomp. Instead, it lingered quietly, remembered by a few for her endurance, her faith, and her ability to navigate a kingdom in crisis with grace. To some, she was a symbol of failed conservatism. To others, a devoted queen who did all she could in a world slipping from her grasp. But history has rarely judged her harshly. In the end, Mariana of Austria became the last great matriarch of the Spanish Habsburgs, a woman who bore the weight of an empire long before it crumbled, and who never let it crush her spirit. What do you think about Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia? Was she a bold and brilliant royal, a woman who dared to wear a crown in a foreign land, who stood beside her husband in war, and who never gave up her vision of a rightful place in Europe? Or was she a romantic exile, a queen without a throne, drifting through court corridors and memory, remembered more for her winter reign than her lasting impact? And what about Mariana of Austria? Was she a steadfast empress, a queen who ruled in the name of her son, preserved tradition through storms of intrigue, and bore the burden of empire with grace and patience? Or a silent casualty of politics, a woman bound by duty, pushed aside by power and remembered not for her voice, but for the battles she lost behind closed doors? We would love to hear your thoughts. Were these women guardians of fading empires or victims of dynastic expectations? Did their strength lie in what they achieved or in what they endured without recognition? Their stories remind us that legacy is not always loud, and that quiet resilience can shape history in unseen ways. Let us know in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales from the past. Stories of courage, choice, and the quiet force behind history. Thank you so much for watching.